All right. Hello. My name is Jen, and I am here with Lucas today from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, from the Robert La Follette School of Public Affairs. And we are presenting a presentation prepared for Open Development Cambodia, titled Increasing Transparency in the Extractive Industries in Cambodia. So a little bit about our client, Open Development Cambodia, um, obviously has the purpose of providing open data regarding Cambodia's development. So the purpose of this project was to dive in a little bit to the extractive industries in Cambodia and highlight the greater need for transparency from the Cambodian government.
And so we sort of approached this project through the lens of four research questions, focused on the revenues from extractive industries in Cambodia. So the first research question was, what revenue requirements apply to extractive concession grantees in Cambodia? And we looked at this question through an analysis of regulatory documentation, policy papers, etc. I will note that we had significant issues accessing documentation through the Ministry of Mines and Energy's website, which forced us to rely on non-governmental sources primarily for that documentation, and ties into our first recommendation. Our second research question was, based on that analysis of the regulatory framework, what are the estimated revenues from extractive concessions in Cambodia? And we specifically focused on non-tax revenues in the mining sector. And we looked for publicly available data on the concessions that are active in Cambodia, production levels, things like that to make these estimates. Our third research question was, based on that estimated revenue, how does that compare to actually reported government revenues? And is there a gap? Do they match up, et cetera? And then finally, based on this broader analysis that we conducted, what policies might be considered to improve transparency and accountability in the extractive industries in Cambodia? And to get into that in more depth, I won't spend too much time discussing the particulars of key regulations in the extractive industries. These are the primary ones on your screen for mining, in addition to a number of other sub-decrees and practices that set out certain fee schedules that we use in our analysis. But I will note that in regards to the revenue question, there are two primary revenue streams for mining concessions in Cambodia. One of these is tax revenues, things like income or corporate taxes on the companies that are active. We don't focus on these in our analysis. Instead, we focus on non-tax revenues, things like royalty revenues, license fees, service rental fees. And we use these to estimate the non-tax revenues from mining in Cambodia. And before we get into the data analysis, I think it's important to acknowledge two general limitations that we had. First is data availability. So the quote you see on your screen here references some a lack of available data on production data for goods in some cases, which limits our ability to fully estimate royalty revenues in Cambodia. But this is also a significant issue that we've encountered for the active concessions in Cambodia, and that lack of licensing information impairs our ability to accurately estimate license revenues as well. The second is an issue of data reliability. So the table you see below is a representation of potential sand royalty revenues from different sources reporting different levels of sand production in the same year. And so the two arrows pointing to these two further left columns are useful to highlight that these discrepancies in production data between sources have potentially significant revenue implications on the scale of millions of dollars. And so we don't have a good way to resolve these contradictory data sources, and we want to acknowledge that there are those issues, and we attempt to account for them in our analysis in some ways. And in terms of our actual analysis itself, we broadly look at the revenues from the licenses, things like license fees and service rental fees, and then royalty revenues. For licenses, we focus primarily on 3 of the 6 main types of licenses for years since 2016 where we could find data. We use 2021 mineral exploration licenses here as an example of how that type of analysis would be conducted. And the key takeaways from this slide are really the difference between this far left number, our minimum estimate, and the far right number, our maximum estimate for exploration license revenues in 2021. And the reason this gap exists is that at least, while there's some variation between different types of licenses, in general, license revenue depends on the whether or not a license fee or a renewal fee is paid in a given year, the size of the concession being rented, And then in some cases, for example, exploration licenses, the age of the license also affects the potential revenues. And the issue is that, to the best of our knowledge, there's no good data source that compiles this information for licenses on an individual level. So, for example, there's no good repository of all the active licenses in 2021, breaks down their type, their size, etc. And what that forces us to do is make instead sort of approximations based on some information we were able to locate about the aggregate number of active licenses of a type in a given year, and some approximations of the average size of concessions that we make. And so that results in this sort of very broad discrepancy between the far left, which is the lowest surface rental fee and no license fees being paid, versus the maximum, which would assume all companies paid a license fee and they paid the maximum surface rental fee. And the likely number actually falls within, we think the number would likely fall somewhere within this range, but due to the paucity of information, we can't narrow it down more than this sort of range of estimates. We do a similar analysis for royalty revenues. And so I want you to focus first on the right side of this graph. The red column here represents production data only for 2021. So only goods that we could locate 2021 production data for. And we calculate the revenue here, which we estimated approximately $19 million, using royalty rates that were set in late 2020 with this 2021 production data. However, we know from other sources that report data on production, for example, 2019, and also the royalty schedule itself, that we're likely missing certain goods that we don't have production data on. To attempt to partially account for this, the orange bar substitutes 2019 production data for goods that we don't have data on in 2021. So we take that 2019 production data, assess the 2020 royalty rates, and then add that total to our initial estimates. And that pushes our total range up to around, our total estimate to around $40 million, which, as we'll discuss in more detail in the next slide, is actually larger than the entire reported non-tax revenue stream from mining in 2021. So one potential explanation for this is that the same document that sets rates in 2020 also mentions that based on the type of good produced, revenues might go to different accounts. So some might go to the national revenue, some might go to subnational account governments, and some might go into a deductible income stream. And to account for this split, we have this left side column where the royalty revenues, when we account for the split, drop to somewhere between 13 and $25 million. Our issue is that the sources we use to determine non-tax revenues reported by the government make no mention of this split. And the same source that sets royalty rates seems to suggest that either the Department of, or the Ministry of Mines and Energy or provincial departments should be aware of all payments. So it's unclear whether we should actually be accounting for this revenue split when we compare estimates against the reported revenues. And we account for both situations in order to sort of attempt to resolve the situation. And leading to our main point, our core finding is that the reported government revenues in 2021 are plausible, but our estimates are highly uncertain, and we need more information about production data, active licenses, in order to confidently verify the government's reported numbers. And so in this graph, the clusters of bars from left to right sort of introduce additional levels of uncertainty into our analysis. So on the far left, we have only 2021 production data. And minimum estimates only include the minimum license revenues that we can estimate, and also account for this potential royalty split, where we're only representing the national revenue. The orange maximum revenue estimates take the maximum license revenue estimates and also do not account for the royalty split. And what we see in 2021, at least on the far left, is that with just the data available for 2021, we don't come anywhere near the reported number of 30 million. And this number is derived from a article in late 2021 reporting revenue for the first 9 months, and also the estimate of the final revenue at the end of the year. And we take that estimate and use that as our $30 million number. If we account for additional revenues from non-2021 data, our estimates increase to between 25 and 44 million, and that captures the $30 million figure. But again, this sort of broad uncertainty about the underlying data itself means that we can't really resolve the millions of dollars of differences on either side of this number to actually verify that 30 million. And then if we attempt to account for potentially underreporting sand production from some of our sources in 2021, these estimates increase further and still capture that $30 million number, but suffer from the same sort of issues with data uncertainty. And so holistically, while we do think it's a good sign that the government numbers are plausible, there's a lot of information that we still need, which will tie into our second and third recommendations, to verify that number explicitly.
Okay, so now diving into our recommendations based on our findings. The first recommendation deals with Ministry of Mines and Energy website improvements, which we believe is just an administrative governance adjustment. So the basis for this is that throughout our project, we had a lot of difficulty accessing documents through the website. So we had to look through non-government sources, such as relying on information from ODC. So we identified two areas that we believe the Ministry of Mines and Energy website can be improved. The first is simply through providing more access to these documents. We know that they have them in some capacity because they are listed on the website. However, in a lot of cases, when you go to download them, review them, you are faced with a 403 error. So this is just a simple fix, but it would go a long way to providing more access to information. The second is to update the press release tab on the website to foster more community engagement. And this is based off of the Ministry of Economics and Finance that Cambodia has, which we believe is a really good model for what the Ministry of Mines and Energy can do. By just providing more information about what's been going on, certain projects that are happening throughout the region. In particular, Cambodia has a grant that is available for people who have lost land or are facing negative impacts from the extractive industries in Cambodia. But a lot of people aren't aware of this grant, and therefore it's not super effective at the time. We believe these two fixes are very feasible given that Cambodia is working on a digital government policy to make information widely available to the public through the internet. Go to the next one. Our second recommendation is more of a legislative focus, and this addresses, as Lucas pointed out, the a lot of uncertainty that exists in the government data. So we believe that there needs to be more clarification of the concessions process, and this would be remedied by releasing the important information about revenues, where they're coming from, etc. And this includes information about the number of active licenses, the size of each concession with applied rates, and just any other fee associated with specific contracts. And so the chart here is just a review of the earlier chart, which highlights that different sources of revenue do not necessarily align with each other. And we believe that providing this data through the government would remedy this gap. And our third and final recommendation is more of a long-term goal. And we believe that this would be for Cambodia to join the EITI and become compliant. The EITI is the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which is an international organization focused on transparency and oversight in the extractive industries in each member country. So they provide a set of good governance practices and would ask each country to become compliant with the EITI standard, which encourages these practices. So some of the benefits that we found of EITI membership include higher levels of civil participation and more government accountability. And then secondly, EITI is a large network of over 50 countries, and it taps into a global network of just really smart people who work in the extractive industries. So it encourages growth. And then it also encourages investment from a lot of international investors, including there's a high relationship between EITI membership and more FDI coming into the country. So we believe that this would be really beneficial to not only encouraging better government practices, but also just for developing the industry in general. So those are our 3 recommendations based on our findings. And as I said, the EITI membership and compliance is a long-term goal, but we believe that Cambodia would greatly benefit from all 3 of these recommendations, and they would really target some of the uncertainty that we found in our presentation.
And we'd like to thank you all for listening and hope that this presentation has been informative and that the launching event for ODC goes well.